Great. So this is, in fact, there was one of our attendees who said you don't have enough on the built environment and real estate, and your next year you got to have more. So I'm delighted to have you all here to help us think through what is a significant contribution to climate change, of course, thinking about cities, thinking about structures. Maybe I'll start with you, Rohit. What is the New York City master plan for transforming the built environment, given that we have an issue of how do you encourage people to renovate, to upgrade? We're not going to build a whole lot of new stock relative to the existing stock. And we do have something of a crisis around the world post-pandemic with urban commercial real estate. Is there a way to do something of a jiu-jitsu and see that as an opportunity? Can you give us an inside look as to where you're going with this?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us. And, I think it's true in all developed, mature cities, right, that there are basically two things that we are working on. One is reducing emissions related to buildings, which is largely HVAC. Not entirely, but that is the toughest nut to crack. And transportation. And it varies a bit depending on level of sprawl and climate. In Los Angeles, it's going to be more transportation than buildings. In New York, it's going to be far more buildings than transportation. And so those really are the two things that we're focused on. The reality is that buildings in New York are the toughest nut to crack. As you said, the vast majority of the buildings we're going to have 50, even 100 years from now, we already have. So it is a question of renovation. And that is really difficult because buildings are complex, and anything you do to a building system requires a lot of disruption, right? Just think about somebody tells you you need to change the wiring in your kitchen. Like, your mind explodes because you don't just think about the wiring, it's also the patching up. It's how many days am I not going to be able to cook dinner? It's like all of that, and you think about that across an entire building. And so the reality is we've been working on making buildings more energy efficient in New York. This is my second time around in city government. I led sustainability for the Bloomberg administration. We've been working on this since 2007. And we really did come as a city to 2019 when we adopted a mandate that basically said buildings are going to have a carbon budget, and they're going to have to start down a glide path on it's a mathematical equation. Greenhouse gas emissions per square foot, and a sliding scale that takes you down to zero in 2050. And that really is the cornerstone of what we are doing. This is a breathtakingly difficult challenge. Mm-hmm. Our estimates are that it is going to cost between $10 and $15 billion by 2030 to achieve the first major step. Mm. And that's across roughly 15 or 16,000 buildings that are going to have to do work. Now, there are 1 million buildings in New York City. The vast majority of our square footage and the vast majority of our energy consumption are in the largest 65,000, and that's what this law covers.
So I was going to ask you, what is the long tail effect here versus sort of the 80-20 rule, where a small handful of buildings can be targeted and somehow either bullied or bribed to do the right thing?
Mandated. Not bullied, not bribed. They're very different. Mandated and to a certain extent incentivized. Look, the reality is, and this is something that I think is a real issue for people who care about cities and sustainability. Going back 15, 20 years ago when we started thinking about this, we made collectively the observation that cities are efficient. Cities are the place where, and this is true in the United States, it's true in Toronto, it's true in all sorts of places, that generally speaking, the densest city in a given country among, again, OECD countries, it gets different when you get into less wealthy countries. Their cities are their most efficient, their most carbon efficient communities.
That's right. Yes.
The interesting thing I think that we're going to have to face is that ultimately it's going to be easier to electrify that suburban single-family home if you've got the roof space for solar panels, if you've got the garage, as the gentleman from Uber was saying, to charge your car. Mm-hmm. Like, all of a sudden, that's an easier lift. An apartment building in New York City, that is really hard. And so it's the long tail, the reality is of those million structures, something like 700,000 of them in New York City are 1 to 4 family homes. We don't think about that as the archetype of New York City, but that is still the majority of those buildings. They're a little bit difficult. Those homes in New York City tend to be lower income. They tend to be in less good shape, so there are some real challenges. But nonetheless, I think I'm less worried about the long tail. I'm far more worried about overcoming the inertia and getting this large group of difficult to fix buildings underway.
So those are some of the challenges we have to deal with. I want to turn to you, Tori. You are hopeful that we can maybe re-engineer cities, bring us closer to nature. Can you tell us about some of your ideas on what we can do on that front?
Yeah, and so thank you. Thank you for having us. I'm happy to be here to champion nature-based solutions. So I represent 16,000 landscape architects in the States, and there are about 70,000 landscape architects in the world. And you know, post-pandemic, there's been obviously a better appreciation for the outdoor environment. But certainly our members have been designing and redesigning spaces for decades, and particularly designing spaces to incorporate green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And some of those examples and ideas are, you mentioned redesigning and reconfiguring buildings. A lot of buildings are being redesigned and reconfigured to have green roofs, right? And using green roofs to sort of reduce the cost to actually energize the building. So a green roof is, we have bio-solar roofs that are being designed now that actually have co-benefits for both reducing the heat cost, but also reducing the cost to cool the building. And we're seeing more. I just did a focus group in Texas with developers, landscape architects, and city officials, and clients are beginning to demand those types of solutions more often. Citizens are demanding those types of solutions more often because they actually see the co-benefits, not just of carbon drawdown, but for heat island effect being reduced because of nature-based solutions. And so I think the main takeaway here has to be that this has to be an integrated, multifaceted approach. There is no one set solution to any of this, and we don't have time to sort of exclude one solution or prioritize one over the other.
What's the snag? Is it permitting or is it financing maybe? You know, what's the reason everyone doesn't do your wonderful ideas?
Well, I think most people do, right? I think most people sort of understand and sort of they hear nature-based solutions and they think a one-dimensional solution set, right? They think it's nice to have trees. They don't fully understand the co-benefits of it, right? They don't understand that, you know, trees draw down carbon and the impact that can have on the larger air quality and living and mental components of that work.
Sure.
And so it is certainly
the
financing.
heat island effect can be
Huge,
as well.
right? It can completely change the experience of not just cities, but communities in suburbs.
Right.
And so I think it's an education component, and I think that the more folks are becoming educated about nature-based solutions, I think that it is being demanded more, and I think financing will shift towards that. We were at COP last year, and there was a lot of conversations, more than the year before. We were there the year before. There are many more conversations happening now about integrating nature-based solutions and climate-positive design as part of the solution set than ever before. So I think it's an education component, and I think the financing will follow.
Let's turn to you, John. Your organization has a analysis of sustainable cities that you will publish. And can you share with us some of the insights you gained from, I think there's one forthcoming, if I'm not mistaken.
Published it yesterday.
Yesterday, even better.
Yeah.
It's online, everyone can enjoy
to be with you. It's called the Sustainable Cities Index 2024. You can download it at arcadis.com. It's a free report. We analyzed 100 cities. This is the 6th iteration of the report. We started in 2015. We compete with the Economist Livability Index. The difference being we measure 67 indicators in 2024. The Economist in your last one measured 37. But you're measuring.
We're frugal.
We're frugal, yeah. But you're measuring different things. Yeah, you're like measuring cultural experiences in cities, and we're measuring water quality and these types of things.
Really complimentary.
They're very complimentary. In fact, I don't really see them as competitors, but I thought the audience would enjoy that. At the end of the day, right, we have to humor this up. But it's really cool. It's compelling. Amsterdam comes in first, which, if you've ever been to Amsterdam, shouldn't be a surprise. It's like the most active transport city hitting the mobility button with great metro and tram and rail infrastructure and ferries. So Amsterdam is number one. We rank 100 cities, and it's worth a read. And
What's number 100?
what's number 100? I don't remember, but it's a southern hemisphere city.
Okay.
I guarantee you that.
Maybe more to the point, what are some attributes of the bottom tier compared to the first tier? Or what,
Yeah.
what are attributes of success versus what holds cities back?
Let me answer it this way. We put in a new pillar. We do planet, people, and profit, which is a triple bottom line, and then we've added progress. And we classified those 100 cities according to 4 progress criteria. Those who have sustained momentum. Most likely those cities are European or American, North American, and have a sustainability plan, and Asian cities as well. Second is cities that are sort of losing momentum, that the early gains, the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and now they're in the final 20 to 30%, more timely, more expensive. They are cities who do not have momentum, and they're languishing, don't have the funds, don't have the wherewithal, don't have the policies. And then there are cities who are beginning to build momentum. Particularly, we see that in China and Asia. So that's how we classified the 4 cities as we look at their progress over the last 10 years.
Let's ask our man from the city here, where do you see yourself? Without looking at his rankings, how would you categorize New York City's progress? Because you've been involved for a long time with this.
Look, I think, as I said, New York starts out with some real advantages, right? And in addition to compactness and overall energy efficiency,
And an extensive subway system.
Yeah, exactly. The transit system, the park system, our water system has been a hallmark of New York City of good planning and good investments for nearly 200 years. Most of the time in rankings like these, New York City is in the top 10. It's probably in that area. One of the things that I find striking as I look at these rankings and have done so for a very long time is they do wind up being a little predictable because you ask the same question about other metrics. You say, well, all right, what's the list of cities that have little governmental corruption? What's the list of cities that are farthest ahead on embracing technology? What's the list of cities that do best in terms of housing quality or air quality? It's a really, really similar list. And the bottom line, I think, is that insofar as sustainability is really a reflection of good governance, the cities that have good governments are going to pull ahead, right? And so, New York City is almost never at the top of that list. It's always places like Copenhagen or Singapore, right? And then you've always got London and New York right there in kind of the close second tier, but we're big cities. We aren't quite as well run, frankly, as Singapore and Copenhagen and sometimes Amsterdam. And then to your point, about the cities in the Southern Hemisphere, you've got a lot of cities that are desperately struggling with really basic challenges, right? And so, a city that is still trying to provide basic sanitation and toilets, they are not going to be able to be plowing ahead on some of these other things.
We have a question from the floor that talks about consumption-based emissions, which might be a more honest snapshot of a city and population's emissions. I wonder, how do you think about this here in New York, but maybe with your rankings here, John? How do you account for that?
Well, we measure greenhouse gas emissions. Right? I love the story from Walmart this morning when they did a briefing with their supply chain, and the guy said, well, I don't have greenhouses, so I'm not really responsible for participation. But we measure greenhouse gas emissions. All cities in the world measure greenhouse gas emissions. That data is readily available. And it's on a per capita basis. And it's also measured in pounds or kilos. And it's very, very accessible. Sometimes it's at the country level. We have to extrapolate. But most cities are measuring, air quality, emissions, carbon, and so the data is readily available.
Well, I'll pick up on that. So, for a good 20 years, right, cities have focused on geographic-based emissions, right? You basically draw a line around the city boundary. You try to figure out, how many vehicle miles traveled have taken place, what's the combustion of natural gas or of heating oil, et cetera, that takes place within the city boundaries, and then you account for imported electricity. In part, that was a sign. I was responsible for New York City's first carbon inventory, which we published in 2007, and that was all the data you could imagine getting at the time, right? The world has moved on and evolved, and in fact, last year New York City published, and I'm really pleased with this, our first integrated consumption and geographic inventory that takes into account the carbon footprint of the food we import and consume, the clothing, the electronics, all of that. What's interesting,
Embedded carbon, as it were.
well, so it includes, there's a separate, that's kind of a third issue, right? The embodied carbon of the concrete and steel in this building, the subway system, et cetera, that's of course a sunk cost. That already exists. So the consumption-based inventory will take into account what we are bringing into the city in terms of new steel, new concrete, et
So
cetera.
flow rather than stock.
Correct. And at some point, I think the cities of the world are going to have to get to kind of a balance sheet analysis as well, but the consumption-based is where we need to go next. And what's really interesting, two things jumped out at me about this that I learned from doing this. Number one is that the consumption-based inventory is not necessarily a more accurate picture. And here's the reason. So when we did our first consumption-based inventory, I got the results back and I said, this is ridiculous. Where'd all the buildings go? And so if you think about the rules for a consumption-based inventory, you have to allocate a given company to where its consumers are. So what happens? Goldman Sachs, the vast majority of their customers are not in New York City. So the Goldman Sachs headquarters is removed from New York City's carbon inventory when it comes to consumption-based.
But they moved to Jersey City.
No, they didn't. Not the headquarters.
Still in Battery Park.
But my point is that it winds up painting an inaccurate picture of the fact, in fact, that New York City has a lot of power over those commercial office buildings. And so what we did, and we did this jointly with the C40 cities and with London, is we actually developed a methodology to integrate the two. So we eliminated the double counting. And so now we have a perspective on the total carbon emissions that New Yorkers have influence over.
Right.
Either as voters and through our government, which includes regulating the Goldman Sachs headquarters building, or through their personal choices, such as the food they consume and the clothing they buy. And what's significant about that, when you put it all together, in New York City, buildings still came out number one, transportation still came out number two, but only by a nose, because the close third was food. And I would expect that 5 years from now, as we electrify more and more of our fleet, food will actually be the second largest category. And so in New York, we've started to tackle that. We've begun vegan Fridays at the city public schools. We serve 2 million meals a day, breakfast and lunch, to 1 million school children every day, including a lot of them over the summer. And so we've reduced that significantly. And in our public hospital system, we've gone to a plant-forward menu where the default choice is a vegan or vegetarian option. People can still choose the meat entree if they wish, right? But what we've found is people, one day they forget, they get the default entree, and they actually don't go back because they like it. And so that's a step. Now, the reality is, we've got a lot of command and control over how buildings are managed. We're never going to have command and control over people's food choices. So that's going to be much more about education.
It's interesting you say that. The Paris Olympics, very timely moment. At our event like this that we did in London a few months ago, the chief sustainability officer for the Olympics was on stage discussing with me her plans to impose large amounts of vegan food and vegetarian food on Parisian gourmand attendees of the conference. And I might have expressed some skepticism that this will go over well. They also have tried to squeeze out all air conditioning as much as possible. And I thought to myself, look, both of those are desirable qualities in the abstract as policy choices. But in the hottest moment of the year, when millions get together in public spaces and who happen to be a famously gourmet culture when it comes to food, to feed them unfamiliar, probably disgusting food. You told me about vegan hot dogs that don't sound very good at all, and to have them boiling in these rooms could turn them against climate action in the future, right? I mean, this really seemed to me an example of excess, but let's wait and see. I wait to be surprised in a positive way. I'm sorry, you were going to say.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on this point on data. I mean, so you asked me earlier about what are the challenges around nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, and why aren't people just sort of buying what we're selling, kind of thing, right? And I think one of the things we have to catch up on is data. So we're beginning to do and invest in a lot of research on the economic benefits and the co-benefits of nature-based solutions as part of the solution set, because I think that we can come up, I can cite cases and sort of different sites that have been built and developed, even cities that have, really invested in green infrastructure and seen all of these co-benefits take place in the results. We know that a tree stores a ton of carbon for 40 years. So you multiply that, obviously, right? And you get trees and green infrastructure being a really solid part of the solution set, but we need more data to present to cities and developers to show that. So that it can actually be integrated. Why don't you develop the Internet of Trees?
I mean, people have been talking about this for ages. The sensors are practically free now. We have cloud computing, ubiquitous accessibility, AI to help you.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. So we're doing research as an organization to sort of catch up in that space, because it's really important and it's obvious. So when we talk about it to folks, they sort of nod their head in agreement. But I got to have the data in order to really make the case to move this thing forward. Yeah.
We're running out of time, and there's something I would be remiss if we didn't talk on this panel about congestion pricing. We've had a reversal here in New York at the last minute. Obviously, it was a decision at the state level, not the city level. I want to maybe get the macro perspective, because you've done the cities index, you follow policies across the world. Can you give us a sense, notionally, how common is congestion charging in the leading cities around the world? Obviously, we know about London, we know about Stockholm, we know about Singapore, but is it a rarity or is it more common than that?
It's very uncommon. It's a rarity.
I see.
And it's usually about political will, which was what I think the decision-making processes were in place. There's just been a mayoral election in London. Sadiq Khan, the mayor, that's his number one point of opposition, was the super-sensitive zone, the second zone of congestion pricing in central London. He may have lost the election because of it. I think that's well understood by the political establishment, that is a slippery slope. So we have the infrastructure in place. If you go down, we're ready to turn it on. And the software is ready to go, et cetera. But the political will, I think, changed. We're in election year. New Jersey doesn't like it. The governor of New Jersey has sued. The state of New Jersey has sued New York. I think that's resolved. But I think the suburbs of New York suburbs, particularly the Long Island suburbs, are not really keen on it.
So what's your perspective on this from the city?
Well, look, I think the lesson from London I take is actually very different from what you were saying. In fact, what we saw, Sadiq Khan won by the largest margin in history of the Greater London Authority, which is only 6 elections, but still. And it was a referendum on his adjustment. So I think what we've seen over and over and over again was true in Singapore, which started in 1974. It was true in London. It was true in Stockholm. It's true in Milan. It's true in Rome, where they have a version of this. It's true in Oslo, where they have a version of this. That there's a lot of trepidation, as there was in London, and there was a by-election right about the time that the ULEZ in London was turned on that went against the Labour Party, and it was attributed, maybe not, but it was attributed to that. But what we've seen consistently is that it's fear, and once it gets turned on, it winds up being remarkably successful. The example in Stockholm, they actually did this explicitly. They turned it on for 6 months as a pilot, they turned it off, then they had a referendum. And it won by something like 60-40, right? Because at the end of the day, it works. And just again, we heard on the previous panel, like people are worried about the cost of moving to an electric vehicle. Once they move, they realize they're saving money, right? And so this is the same kind of thing. And I think it is, to your point, a point about political will. It's about having nerves and having leadership and not being afraid, not caving. But it is, I think, an example of how if we are going to make the changes we need to make, whether it's opening our minds to different ways of eating, thinking about the responsibilities of owning real estate as including reducing your carbon emissions and not just cutting your costs, right? If we're going to actually tackle climate change, we've got to be willing to embrace some change.
When this initiative comes back, as I hope it does in some future political cycle, can you push for zero-emission vehicles to be exempted from this charge? As I understand, they were not to be exempted in the initial New York charge.
Well, look, the reality
in London
is...
they are, in other cities they are.
Yes and no. I mean, the reality is that...
it would be a great spur to the market.
It's called congestion pricing, and the reality is that an electric vehicle causes every bit as much congestion as an ICE vehicle. And so we have to remember that we are trying to optimize for a number of things. You've had a number of examples. I guess I could countenance, I could imagine if I were setting the rules, a 2-year exemption. The problem is that temporary exemptions have a tendency of becoming permanent, right? And the reality is that if electric vehicles take off the way they need to, and in fact the way the law in New York State and increasingly across the country and whatever requires them to, then we're just going to have nobody paying the charge, right? So I think we've got to be willing.
If only we should be so lucky that there's so many EVs that nobody pays the charge.
We've got to be willing to walk
That's
the
the
walk,
argument,
right?
Yeah.
Which is to say we're going to charge congestion, and we need people to take transit into the most transit-rich place in the entire country.
Yeah. Okay. You heard it here. No exemptions for EVs, but we're going to have lots of EVs. One final word of optimism from many of you that wants to share a glimmer of hope for our audience as we leave.
I'll refer to this question, anonymous question. Should cities think about investing in infrastructure in the existing cities or relocate parts or all of the city? And
well, you've already sent Goldman Sachs to New Jersey. I heard that.
I believe they are in Jersey City, but
they're in
anyway,
both places. Yeah.
I believe we should invest in our existing cities and densify them and make them more livable and walkable and sustainable.
Hear, hear. I'm
green.
a big fan of cities, especially this one. Thank you all for joining us on this panel. Audience, give them a nice round of applause.